in this lecture, what we want to do is explore Georg Simmel. Now, Simmel is an interesting figure because in many ways he's been kind of put on the periphery of social theorists. So when we think of social theorists, we think of the big three, the pantheon of social theorists, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. And Simmel, to some degree, is not in that kind of league. He's put on the periphery. So the question really is why? Why is he not considered part of that kind of primary pantheon of social theorists? His contribution to social theory is significant. But one of the possible reasons why is the way he viewed society, the nature of it, the study of it, was not from the perspective of large structures. Rather, he wanted to focus on interactions. And so his whole approach is radically different. So let's first start by trying to understand his specific approach. So he adopts a micro-sociological approach. So to understand this, we need to see it in opposition to the other structural approaches. So before Simmel, most sociologists adopted a very structural view of society. What does that mean, that they adopted a structural view of society? So in essence, it was that classical macro-sociology, that there were structures could be applied onto society that would explain human behavior. So the class system or the division of labor. These are large-scale structures that supposedly explain how or why behavior occurs. Now, what's the problem with these large-scale structural approach? What would be the problem, say, with this kind of macro approach? So the first thing is that it tends to kind of over-focus on structure. So structure over agency. So in essence, what we mean by that is the whole kind of social structure, things like class, are seen to be kind of more important than the individual agency. So when you look at class structure, like as advocated by Marx, you have the proletariat, you have the bourgeoisie, and what this structure explains is the power imbalance related to wealth in society. Now that disregards, because in essence you're born into your class structure, that influences you, that tells you how to think, how you behave, it socializes you from early age. So in essence, it undermines the individual agency. So one aspect that's problematic is that there is this emphasis over structure over agency. The other aspect that's important is basically macro-sociology looks at this whole idea of functionality. And we saw that last week with Durkheim, where he proposed that the division of labor gives modern society interdependence, right? So he's talking about these large-scale processes. So you have the individuals, and you've got basically the social facts, you've got basically the collective consciousness, you've got the institutions, and these things largely coerce and constrain individual behavior. So in essence, what structuralists are saying, what macro-sociology is saying, large-scale structures influence individual behavior. Now, for Simmel, this was not really correct. And for him, the way he saw it was from a micro perspective, which is basically he wanted to focus on the individual and his interactions with others. So what happens when we interact? The interactions. So if we take at the start point of understanding society, the nature of society, then the start point for Simmel is individuals interacting with other individuals. When we have this exchange, because what happens when two people interact? Whether it's friendship, marriage, these are all interactions, right? So there is an exchange. It could be exchange of ideas, exchange of knowledge. There can be conflict. There can be cooperation between these interactions. But ultimately, once you start, the starting point is individual interactions. then you have wider kind of formations of things like social groups, norms, values. So in essence, it's all the core of understanding society is right here. The nature of society is the interactions that we participate in. So what he's trying to say then is that if you look at it, the key point to study is this interaction. So he says there is two aspects. There's the forms of interaction, and then there's the small group that has an impact. So what he's saying here is basically, when you look at interactions, there's the forms of interactions. So what you need to understand here is two things, the content and the form. So what he says, there is content and form. So for now, we will explain this in a bit more depth. A good example would be, let's take two types of interaction. If you take a friendship between two people and a business partnership between two people. Now that's two individuals interacting. Why do friendships occur? Well, there's the kind of social bond, right? Now in terms of content, a friendship bond and a friendship interaction is different to a business partnership. So the content of those two interactions, those relationships are different. But the forms, what Simmel says, the forms are shared. What does he mean by that? That when you have a friendship and a business partnership, the content differs, but the form has similarity. What does that mean? That there is similarity between friendship and business partnership. In what way? Where is the shared similarity? So when you have exchange between interactions, between individuals, whether it's a friendship or a business partnership, those relationships have similarities, such as trust, right? So when you're in a social relationship with a friend, it's built on trust. When you engage in a business partnership, it's based on trust. So there's also a kind of reciprocal nature to the interaction. So you both kind of give and take, even in friendship and in a business partnership. And there's also collaboration, right? So the content will differ, but the form has similarity. So that shapes the interactions. It impacts interactions. The other aspect that he identifies is the small groups. So an important point here for Simmel is that interactions change depending upon group size. So the interactions that we participate can change depending on the size of the group. So if you're looking at first, say, a dinus, that's an interaction between two people, right? So two people, one and one, interacting together. So a good example of that may be a romantic relationship, a marriage, right? So you have the husband and you have the wife engaging in this type of relationship. A tridus is basically where you have three people in that interaction. So you could have, let's say, if we look at this to make sense of it from a family dynamic. So let's say you have one family that has basically one sibling and one parent, right? That's a didus. Now in a tridus, basically you have, let's say, two siblings and one parent. Now soon as you add another sibling, that will change the interaction, the nature of the relationship. So for example, in a family dynamic where it's just one child, one parent, that might be more intimate in terms of the interaction. But now that you have two children, you have competition perhaps between the siblings for intimacy, which changes the interaction, right? So this is what he's trying to say. The whole focal point for understanding society has to be how we interact, right? The how and the why of it. And that gives rise to other things like norms and social bonds. So this is kind of some of the the key points starting off, right? So Simmel's work, he has produced extensive works. But we said one of the reasons possibly that why sometimes he's put on the periphery is, one, because of this approach. He doesn't really even perhaps accept that there is such a thing as society. He asserts that really there's just a web of interactions. And this is informed in his works, the books that he's written. Because the focal point of what he wants to look at is how human beings interact, how that shapes our behavior. So this is why he's looked at things like money. How does money shape individual behavior? Money has a huge power over us. It shapes the way we think, the way we feel, and certainly the way we interact with people. Another important text that's in his Sociology, Investigations of Forms of Association, is the phenomenon of the stranger. He examines this quite peculiar social phenomenon that is the stranger. The stranger exists in all societies, but what it reveals is an interesting dynamic related to how people interact. So in some ways, his kind of focal point is interaction. Now, one of the reasons as well why he's put on the periphery is because he talks about things like money. He talks of things like the fashion of sociology. Well, these aren't considered those kind of grand sociological questions that Weber and Marx was asking, like inequality, the formation of capitalism. He's looking at very different things, but because he wants to see how people interact based on them. Okay, are there any questions so far? Okay, so we're going to look at some of his major works and concepts. The first text of note is his book on social differentiation, so written in 1890. Now, simply put, what he asserts in this is that the self, the creation of the self, is purely dependent on your relation with others. So who you are, how you form your identity, does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs through interaction with people and objects around you. So these interactions create your identity and your conception of the self. So that's important. Now, what he really says then is, okay, so differentiation, how does that come about then? This idea of us creating a sense of myself, my identity, and how does that create distinction between others? So if we refer to what Simmel says, he says basically how individuals and groups form identities and develop social structures through differentiation. The greater the differentiation of functions, the more numerous and more varied are the social groups to which each individual belongs, and the more frequently he or she will stand at the intersection of different, even opposing groups. Any idea what he's trying to say here? So let's take it from first principles. So what Simmel says, simply put, is if you go back to the simpler societies, tribal society, or a small village society, those societies, in essence, create and cultivate conformity. So we're talking about pre-modern society. Why did pre-modern societies generate conformity? How did it generate conformity? More so than the modern. What was it about tribal society? What was it about these earlier societies before the modern age that created conformity? So if we look at these societies, they foster homogeneity. So why is that the case? Why is there a lack of diversity within these societies? So if you take a hypothetical example, let's take a small fishing village in North Wales 300 years ago. This is going to be a very homogeneous society, close-knit community. So it's a fishing village, let's say, somewhere in North Wales a couple of hundred years ago. You'll have a particular family identity. You'll have your religious identity, which is Christian. You'll have your ethnic identity. And you'll have your, let's say, profession, which is you're a fisherman. So these things identify you and the community. Now what we'll see, what creates homogeneous kind of identity is that every member of that community shares that identity. They have the same kind of religion, they have the same ethnicity, they have the same profession. So what that creates is similarity, sameness, and they basically have a lack of diversification. Okay? So what that means then, there's a lot more conformity. Your individual identity is basically merged into this collective group identity. So who you are is dissolved into the communal identity, which again creates greater conformity. So why then you're not going to have much differentiation between people if everyone is pretty much homogeneous, the same kind of identity, same profession. So in the modern, Simmel argues, is where we have the creation of social gaps, social differentiation. So how does this occur? Well, it occurs largely because of the division of labor. All right, so we have in modern society the division of labor and pluralism. So pluralism basically means that there is no singular conception of truth. We have now, because of science, the idea that there are competing truths, which then gives rise to different religions, different beliefs, all in the same community. The division of labor, how does that create differentiation, greater differentiation? So if we said early society was similar based on profession, the division of labor basically created a huge number of different professions, specialist roles. Now in our society, you could be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, an artist, a scientist, right? That creates a social gap at the level of identity. Because now people are identifying according to a different profession. It's not just a singular profession, a fisherman. It's now multiple identities. So what modern society does, it gives us the tools of freedom and individualism to construct broader identities. So there's identities linked to your role in life, yeah? But then there's also opportunities for expanding your social groups. So you can basically join different clubs, societies. This is all about actualizing different lifestyles. So in essence, what modern society does is it gives us the opportunity to create identities that are radically different. We don't have to conform to our community. We don't have to conform to our family. We can construct very wide and different identities. So in essence, what is created is social differentiation, which is important for Simmel. So you could have, say, for example, an artist and a scientist who have widely different kind of jobs, professions. Their whole kind of thinking and feeling and identity is going to be based on a lot of their profession, their experiences. It creates social gaps. It creates gaps between people where you can explore different lifestyles, different kind of identities. So let's take for example a large big city. In large big cities like London, you have social differentiation, which is interesting because you have a population of 7 to 10 million people, and they're very close together, they're in close proximity, right? Yet, even though they have this close proximity, they have social distance. So you've got people together, jammed together in this small space full of millions of people, yet you have social distance. The reason why you have this social distance is because, obviously, of individuality, freedom. But those kind of things give you distance. There's a huge degree of specialization of roles in London. So as a result, because of this, there's this wide specialization of roles, what that means is that you have these large gaps which allows people to follow and pursue very different lifestyles. And also what that does, it kind of makes you indifferent. Individualism in large cities makes you indifferent to the other. So that shapes how you interact. So for example, when I first came to, let's say, Bangor a good 12 years ago, I got freaked out when I was walking down the street and everyone kind of says to you hello, like strangers will say hello. Being brought up in London, no one says hello to anyone. So when people were kind of saying hello to you in the morning, it's a bit weird, it's a bit odd. So if you go on the London Underground, no one says hello, no one interacts, no one talks to the other. You're completely in your bubble of separation. What identity you have can be different. So you can have different identities and it's all kind of accepted in a large kind of metropolis. Okay, so the other concept that we need to run through, the next one is the stranger. So Simmel says basically about the stranger, he says, to be a stranger is naturally a very positive relation. It is a specific form of interaction. What does he mean? It's a special form of relation. It's a special kind of thing. So he further says, the stranger is near and far at the same time, as in any relationship based on merely universal human similarities. Why is the stranger such an interesting social phenomenon for Simmel? What is it about the stranger? Well, the stranger allows us to study different social roles. And in particular, if we take the stranger is unique because the stranger is part of the social group. At one level, he is part of the social group, but then also he is distant from the social group. So he's part of society and distant at the same time. So how is that the case? How can you be near and remote at the same time? So in a physical sense, they're close, they have proximity, they're integrated in the social group, they're integrated in society at the economic level. However, at the social, cultural level, they are separate. They are kind of marginalized or remote in that sense because they are not aware of maybe the cultural norms of society. And so that makes them stand out. That makes them appear different. So take, for example, when I was at university and I was living on halls, there was halls, probably 6 or 7 different rooms. And one of the rooms was occupied by an Uzbek foreign student. And so he basically, at one level, he was part of the group, part of society. He would attend the classes, he would go to the kitchen. So he's part of the physical structure of the university. But at the cultural level, he struggled to fit in. He was socially different, his practices, his norms, his ideas. So at one level, he was marginalized at the social level, but integrated at the kind of proximity physical level. So he kind of existed outside and inside of the social group. Now, for Simmel, what that gives him, the stranger, is the opportunity to make kind of objective judgments about what he sees. Because he's not accepted fully, and he's not completely rejected, he's basically able to observe. So this is why Simmel said, if you look at early anthropologists, when they would study closed societies, tribal societies, they would go to these remote places and want to study the tribe. So they would acknowledge the fact that they were a stranger to that tribe. And what they would do, they would set up very close to the tribe and try to observe the practices, the ideas, the norms of the tribe. And often they would be perceived as a stranger. So that gave them the sense that they were physically close to the tribe. They could see the tribe, they could eat with the tribe, they would sometimes be involved in some of the practices, but they were not part of the tribe. They were not accepted because of the level of beliefs, culture, and society. So, in essence, what it gives them is the opportunity to objectively study the interactions that take place in a natural environment, is what kind of Simmel was talking about. So, if we look at what he's trying to say then, he's trying to say, look, the stranger is connected to the group by general traits, but remains distant due to lack of specific personal connections. So in essence, when we're talking about the stranger in some ways can be a bridge to understanding society, understanding ourselves. Because like we said, they are accepted in the physical space, but they're kind of rejected in the social, cultural space, right? So they're kind of marginalized in that regard. So what we need to understand with the concept of the stranger is also, Simmel believes the stranger is a universal type. What does that mean, a universal type? So strangers exist in all societies, in different contexts. We may have all been a kind of stranger at some point. So I was a stranger when I first came to Bangor. Completely different culture, society, different language to some degree. And so I felt like a stranger, accepted but separate. We could feel like a stranger even within our own family sometimes if we're kind of socially, culturally to some degree disconnected. So in some ways we've all been a stranger. We could have been a stranger when we start a new job. You know, you're in a new place, new environment, you are the stranger initially. So in many ways, that whole perspective influences the interactions, right? So a large part of that, you could say, for example, if you look at migrant communities, they very much embody the stranger. So those migrant communities that have come to the UK, the first generation in particular, they were physically kind of integrated. They basically, bought houses, they worked, they paid taxes. That's integrated at the physical level. The economic level, the first generation of migrants were integrated. However, were they integrated at the social, cultural level? They always appeared distant at that level. Because they had their own forms of dress, their own kind of cultural practices, their own cuisines, which were different to the mainstream society. So those differences have a tendency to externalize you as a community. Now, what's also interesting is the second generation of migrants actually feel a duality when it comes to being the stranger. So they feel strange actually in amongst their own community and in the wider community. So how is that the case? How do they have this duality of being different in their own community and in the main community? Any ideas how? So if we're taking their own community, often because the second generation are born and raised here, they learn English, they adopt the cultural values of society, which kind of makes them a stranger within their own family dynamic, because the first generation sometimes don't speak English, have the connection to the homeland, which creates a separation. So the children of immigrants often feel a stranger in their community or home, and often sometimes they're externalized from mainstream society through things like racism. And so they feel rejected at the social, cultural level in the home and in society. So they feel a sense of this double estrangement, which can cause difficulties for them when they interact. Okay, moving to the next point and text, which is the philosophy of money. So this is probably Simmel's kind of seminal piece, right? The philosophy of money. It's probably the text that you probably heard of. So what does he say? He says money is the purest rectification of means, which becomes a purpose in itself through its continued increase. It transforms the world into an objective where the closest, the most personal and the unique become general and quantifiable. What does he mean here? So when we're talking about, and we're going to talk about this as well in the next slide, money has an abstracting power over us. So money is this thing that in essence is an abstract concept. We've given it power, we've created it and made it a tangible physical thing. Now this thing that is money has power over us we kind of given it this power. We feel that, money has this independent control. It has its kind of own agency. So if you're ever flicking through the news channels and you go onto like the business news channels, and they've always got the stock markets going, and they're going up and they're going down, the way they present it is like this stock market has a life of its own. It has its own kind of energy, it has its own kind of agency, and it could go up tomorrow, it can come down tomorrow. But in essence, this is all something that we've kind of given to money. So the first thing that we need to know for Simmel is that money has a universal measure of value. So it's all about basically this concept, this thing that we created that is money, has this universal measure which is value. Okay, so let me explain that. Money enables us, right, to buy goods, right? So this little, £20 note, I can take it to the supermarket and buy some bread with that money. What that does, money basically reduces everything, whether it's an object or whether it's a service or whether it's a relationship, down to value. Yeah? So what we're talking about here is money reduces everything to a particular value. This is known as the exchange value, right? So if I go and get a haircut has a value. It's a service, but it has a monetary value. If I buy a bag of apples, that has a monetary value. An iPhone has monetary value. The problem with assigning everything monetary value is that what Simmel is saying is that basically if you apply monetary value to every object, every service, every relationship, then you create a kind of qualitative difference between objects. So in essence, what he's talking about is the commodification of life. This is bad because what that does is it creates a detachment between us and the object. The object is just something given monetary value. So let me put it in an example. Let's just say you have an author. He spends his entire life, his life effort writing this one book. He's put his time, his labor, his effort, his love, his passion, his sweat, everything into writing this one book. So it's everything to him. It has significance, emotional attachment to it. Then we get it, and what do we do with it? We put a monetary value on it, that this book is worth £20. So we reduce all that, basically all that effort, all that labor, all that passion, that feeling went into this book. We are detached from it. We just see the monetary value. So if you go into the supermarket and you do your weekly shopping, what do? We're taking the carrots, we're taking the potatoes. We are kind of detached from the fact that the farmer has to wake up 5 o'clock in the morning. He has to, cultivate his farm. He spends all day working hard to produce those products that we just simply take that carrot and put it in. We just see the monetary value. We don't see the sweat, the labor that went into producing that object. So in essence, what money does is it devalues the effort. We're detached from the effort, the significance, the labor, and we just basically see the object, and we see it in monetary value. Carrots, £1, and you put it in. So in essence, this is the problem of money. It commodifies social life. So things like water. Water is an essential thing for life, right? If we don't have water, we die as a species. Yet we have to pay for it. It has been given a value. So this is kind of the problem with money. Now, that's the problem with it in the abstract sense. But Simmel also says there's a positive aspect, which is money, basically, as an exchange, also gives us a sense of freedom, individuality. So how does money do that? So money allows us to navigate our social reality without dependency. So in earlier societies, we might have been dependent on family, on community. But now, in this society, we don't have that same dependency. So let's just take a hypothetical. Let's say you're in a tribe and you want an axe. But you don't want to make an axe, because i.e. to get an axe, you would have to make it, you'd have to produce it. So let's say you take from a friend in the tribe. What does that create? That creates a reciprocal obligation. You have an obligation to return it or give something in exchange. You basically have this responsibility put upon you, reciprocal obligation. But in modern society, we don't have reciprocal obligation. Basically, you can just go into the shop. If you have the money, you can buy it. So money liberates us. It gives us basically the opportunity to buy anything without any reciprocal obligation, without dependency. So we're free in a sense to basically go, make money, buy things that we want, right? So that is a freeing aspect towards money. But then he says also that money has this negative aspect when it comes to relationships and social relations. So how can money have this negative impact on social relations and social bonds? So take, for example, a friendship bond, a friendship relationship. You have two friends, right? And they're friends. This is a social bond. But one lends money to the other. Now, that can change the interaction and the dynamic of their friendship, because now you've created a reciprocal obligation. One friend has given the other money, and what happens then if the other friend doesn't return it? The other friend starts to demand his money back. It creates that reciprocal obligation. It creates dependency. So we can lose in aspects of our friendship, and we can lose that dependency. It can turn into conflict. Okay, so the three major themes of the philosophy of money is these kind of three main points within it. So Simmel says money as a tool of abstraction and freedom. So we kind of mentioned this, that basically money is in many ways this kind of tool that has this abstracting power. So like I said, let's say if you're in a tribe and you want to make a sword, or you want a roast dinner, what are you restricted by? Well, you're restricted by production, right? So if you want a sword, you have to spend the time, effort, labor to make it. If you want a roast dinner, you're going to have to take the time, effort, money, whatever, to make it, right? So you're restricted by the production. But in modern society, money liberates us, and we can just basically go to the supermarket and buy what we want. So that creates this kind of abstract connection to money. Because in essence, like I said, what money does is it basically creates this detachment between us and the object, in simple sense. So that can be a problem, right? So in essence, if you take, for example, a society that is built on a non-monetary system, like bartering, right? Barter does what? It basically takes value and it determines value according to utility and significance, right? So it's not like money. Money is, like I said, creating a detachment between you and the object. So all that effort that the artist or the author or the farmer puts into that product to produce it, to put it there in the supermarket, is immense, but we're detached from that effort. So for Simmel, what he's saying here is basically value, money creates monetary value, and that creates a detachment between us and the object, right? The other thing then is the objectification and the tragedy of culture. So here what he's talking about is this idea that Simmel is arguing that basically money creates this kind of separateness, yes, but what we see is with money, you have these, let's say, individuals, and you have the value. And what also is created is a gap between wealth and culture. So what I'm trying to say, the best way of thinking about this is think of consumer culture. We exist in a commodified society, a consumer culture. We'll go to the supermarket, and if you think about commodification, look how a supermarket is structured. They don't make the first aisle where you can get all your essentials, like eggs, bread, milk, all down one aisle. Why don't they do that? Why do they separate everything so you have to go through this huge supermarket? Because they know that as you're going along, you're just going to buy other things, right? Things you probably might not even need. But it's designed in a way to, attract us through consumer culture. So in essence, what this suggests is that we are detached from the object also at this kind of cultural level, that we basically don't understand the significance of it, which creates this kind of tragedy of culture. Another point that he talks about is the quantification of human values and relationships. Money can be a very impersonal thing. So think about an example. In this society, we have this kind of reciprocal obligation when it comes to gift giving, all right? So my wife's birthday was a couple of days ago, and I had to then go and buy a present that somehow put a monetary value to our love. So it's very difficult. You have to kind of spend a certain amount. If I came back home with a £10 present, that's not enough. So you basically got to go out of your way to show a grand gesture. Also, the problem with obviously gift giving is this kind of reciprocal aspect to it. So if you give someone a gift at Christmas, they're expected to give you a gift, right? So it creates this kind of impersonal thing between the value, the money, and the relationship. Are there any questions on that? Okay, so moving quickly on. So if we look at The Metropolis, which is another book, I'll try to cut through the main arguments. So the main arguments for Simmel is when you have large urban societies, the interactions are different in large-scale societies like in a metropolis. And that creates a different sense of thinking and feeling. So in societies like the large city, most people are quite blasé attitude. Now, what creates a blasé attitude in a large metropolis? Well, because there's this constant bombardment on the senses, there's noise, there's people, there's crowds, there's population, there's adverts, you're constantly bombarded. And what that does then is it desensitizes you to the other. So you're more emotionally detached, you're more indifferent to things. So in essence, what happens then, that impacts the way you interact in a society, a big city. So when sometimes, because I was born in London, my wife was born in a small town. When we both go sometimes to London, she's like, wow, look at all of this. And so if there's a street performer, she'll want to stop and watch. While my instinct is just to get to A to B. Let's go, this is just something that is just noise, ignore it. And yet she's kind of really fascinated by it, wanting to experience it. So this suggests that what happens is those that are kind of born in these large-scale cities inherently become, through their interactions, detached. And yes, there's things like freedom and those types of things, but you become much more kind of goal-orientated, much more calculated. So I need to get to A to B. I'm indifferent to everything else around me. You've put out the noise. Also in cities, there is this heightened sense of danger, right? So there's higher crime. So inevitably, I might be a bit more liberal when I'm using my phone here, where there's less crime. But in London, I'm not going to be out with my phone so obviously, because there is this heightened sense of crime and danger. So what I'm trying to say, and what Simmel is trying to say, the city creates an impact on how we interact, right? So I'm going to jump to the main kind of points that I want to talk about, which is some of the basic points that Simmel talks about. So one key aspect is this idea of relational sociology. According to Simmel, he really articulated this idea of relational sociology. Any idea what we mean by relational sociology? So for Simmel, it's simple. Social life is constituted or constructed by relationships. Not necessarily your individual motives and not necessarily these large-scale structures. So think of an example. You're in a school, right? You have your teachers and you have students, right? Now, the teacher will interact with students, and students will interact with their peers. Now, these interactions are different, right? So what we see is the form and the content will differ. So in many ways, what he's trying to say is that these relationships, the interactions that you have, are basically going to influence behavior, influence both parties. So another kind of key point from all of this is the idea of association. This is one of Simmel's kind of key points. So association, for him, is the essence of society. This is the reason why we come together, how people come together in the interactions. So what we need to understand is there's association based on content, and there's association based on form. Now what he suggests is association based on content is the motivation for the interaction. So it's the question of why. Why are people associating? And the association of form is basically the how. How do they associate? So take, for example, let's say you have a group of friends that like to climb the mountains, right? They like hiking. So from the association of content, the reason why they associate, interact, is because they like to climb mountains. So that's the reason why this group meet. Yeah? So the content is the motivation, why they associate. The form is how they associate. When do they meet? Who basically provides the food? Who determines the trail that they're going to climb? So all of those things might be determined by one person in the group. So that's the how, that's the form aspect of it. So in essence, what we need to understand is that what he's trying to say, and I'll summarize here, and I know I've gone through this way too quick. The focal point for Simmel is all about interaction. The interactions that we engage in shape us and shape our social bonds, yeah? So in many ways, if you think about, say for example, this idea, I suppose one key point that I haven't talked about is the duality of the individual and society. So what we mean by that is the individual, if you look at the individual shapes society through their interactions, and society basically provides the context. Any idea what we mean by that? So give it a quick example. Take the family. The family is not determined exclusively by your biological bond. It's actually determined by your interactions, the intimacy, the exchange of emotions, the daily routines. All of these things make the family actually what it is. So it's not necessarily just basically society telling us how we live. Individual interactions shape society, and society provides a context for our interactions. And I know I'm rushing through this quickly, so maybe at some point we might touch a base again on some of this, just because we've run through it way too quickly. But that's the bulk of it. The focal point, macro sociology. Okay, I'll end it there.